This is why you need to pay attention to Rafah. The conflict between Israel and Hamas escalated sharply this week, casting a long shadow over the region. The latest flashpoint. Rafah, a densely populated city in the Gaza Strip, where an Israeli airstrike resulted in a devastating loss of civilian life. The strike, which Israel claimed targeted Hamas tunnels, drew immediate international condemnation. Adding to the volatile mix, Israel launched a ground assault into Rafah, intensifying its military campaign against Hamas militants. The images coming out of Rafah, rubble-strewn streets, overwhelmed hospitals, and grieving families serve as a stark reminder of the human cost of this intractable conflict. The situation in Rafah poses a critical test for the Biden administration, which has sought to balance supporting Israel's right to defend itself and upholding human rights. The White House, caught in the crossfire of the escalating conflict, has found itself walking a diplomatic tightrope. In the wake of the Rafah strike, the administration has sought to balance its unwavering support for Israel's security with calls for restraint and a de-escalation of violence. President Biden, in a carefully worded statement, expressed his unwavering support for Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas rocket attacks, while also emphasizing the need to avoid civilian casualties. The administration has also been actively engaged in behind-the-scenes diplomacy, urging both sides to show restraint and work towards a ceasefire. The administration's efforts, however, have been met with limited success. The violence continues unabated, and the humanitarian situation in Gaza deteriorates with each passing day. Some argue that the administration's rhetoric has emboldened Israel, while others contend that it has not done enough to pressure Israel to end its military operations. Whether this approach can succeed in bringing about a lasting peace remains to be seen. The escalating crisis in Rafah has reignited the debate over President Biden's red line in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. During his campaign, Biden pledged to hold Israel accountable for actions deemed to undermine a two-state solution, raising expectations for a more assertive U.S. approach. However, the administration's response to the current crisis, characterized by calls for restraint but no concrete threats of repercussions, has left many questioning the existence and significance of this red line. Critics argue that the administration's reluctance to exert more pressure on Israel, despite the mounting civilian casualties in Gaza, suggests a retreat from Biden's earlier pronouncements. The absence of tangible consequences, they argue, risks emboldening hardliners on both sides and further diminishing the prospects for a negotiated settlement. The current crisis has exposed the limitations of U.S. influence in this intractable conflict. The events in Rafah have triggered a wave of international condemnation, with world leaders and international organizations expressing alarm over the escalating violence and the mounting civilian casualties. The UN Security Council, convened for an emergency session, has struggled to find common ground, with the U.S. blocking a joint statement calling for an immediate ceasefire. The European Union, traditionally a vocal critic of Israeli settlement activity, has condemned the violence on both sides and called for an immediate ceasefire. The Arab League, meanwhile, has accused Israel of war crimes and called for international action to protect Palestinian civilians. The international outcry reflects the global significance of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which continues to resonate far beyond the region. The escalating violence also threatens to destabilize an already volatile region, with the potential to spill over into neighboring countries. Section 5. Hamas's calculus. Exploiting the chaos, deepening the divide. Hamas, the Islamist militant group that controls the Gaza Strip, has found itself at the center of the latest conflagration with Israel. While the group's rocket attacks on Israeli cities have drawn international condemnation, they have also served to bolster its standing among some Palestinians who view Hamas as the only force willing to confront Israel. The group's strategy, however, comes at a heavy price for civilians in Gaza, who bear the brunt of Israel's military response. Some analysts argue that Hamas is seeking to exploit the current crisis to consolidate its control over Gaza and undermine its rivals in the Palestinian Authority. Regardless of its motivations, Hamas's actions have had devastating consequences for the Palestinian people. The civilian population, trapped between Hamas's militancy and Israel's military might, is paying a heavy price for the group's actions. Section 6. The Iron Dome and the Tunnels. A military and moral quagmire. The current conflict has once again highlighted the stark asymmetry of power between Israel and Hamas. Israel, armed with advanced weaponry and technology, including the Iron Dome missile defense system, possesses a clear military advantage. Hamas, on the other hand, relies on a combination of crude rockets and a network of tunnels to launch attacks and evade Israeli strikes. Israel's Iron Dome system, while highly effective in intercepting incoming rockets, has not been able to prevent all casualties or eliminate the psychological impact of Hamas's attacks. Hamas's use of tunnels dug beneath the Gaza-Israel border presents a unique challenge for Israel. These tunnels, used to infiltrate militants and launch surprise attacks, have been a source of tension for years. The military imbalance between Israel and Hamas, coupled with the unconventional tactics employed by both sides, has created a complex and dangerous battlefield. The use of advanced technology by Israel, while providing a tactical advantage, has not brought the conflict any closer to resolution. Section 7. The limits of diplomacy. Stalemate at the UN, frustration in capitals. The escalating violence in Rafah has exposed the limitations of international diplomacy in resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Despite urgent calls for a ceasefire from world leaders and international organizations, the fighting continues unabated, underscoring the deep mistrust between the parties and the lack of political will to forge a lasting peace. The UN Security Council, the body tasked with maintaining international peace and security, has been rendered largely ineffective by divisions among its permanent members. The United States, Israel's closest ally, has repeatedly blocked resolutions critical of Israel, while Russia and China have accused the U.S. of bias and inaction. The stalemate at the UN reflects the broader geopolitical rivalries that often overshadow efforts to address the conflict. The lack of trust between the parties, the absence of a viable peace process, and the influence of spoilers on both sides continue to undermine efforts to find a lasting solution. A defining moment for President Biden and his foreign policy agenda, the crisis in Rafah has forced the administration to confront the complexities of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the challenges of balancing its commitment to Israel's security with its stated values of human rights and diplomacy. The administration's response, characterized by a combination of unwavering support for Israel and muted calls for restraint, has drawn criticism from both sides of the aisle, highlighting the difficult choices facing the U.S. in the region. The administration's decision to block a UN Security Council statement calling for a ceasefire, while defending Israel's right to defend itself, has been perceived by some as a sign that the U.S. is reverting to its traditional role as Israel's protector, even at the expense of international consensus. The crisis in Rafah has exposed the limits of U.S. influence in a region grappling with entrenched conflicts and shifting power dynamics. The administration's response will have far-reaching consequences, not only for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but also for America's standing in the Middle East and its ability to advance its interests in a volatile region. By leveraging its diplomatic weight and working with international partners, the administration could chart a new course that prioritizes de-escalation, diplomacy, and a just and lasting peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. The Biden administration's response to the Rafah crisis has raised questions about the future of U.S. policy in the Middle East and its role as a mediator in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. The administration's cautious approach, characterized by a reluctance to exert significant pressure on Israel and a preference for behind-the-scenes diplomacy, stands in contrast to the more assertive approach adopted by previous administrations. The U.S., once deeply invested in brokering peace between Israelis and Palestinians, appears to be taking a step back, acknowledging the intractability of the conflict and the limits of its own influence. This shift has been met with a mix of apprehension and resignation in the region, with some fearing that the U.S. withdrawal will create a vacuum that empowers spoilers and undermines the prospects for peace. The Biden administration's decision to prioritize other foreign policy challenges, such as climate change and competition with China, suggests a recalibration of U.S. priorities in the Middle East. The changing dynamics of the Middle East, coupled with the evolving priorities of the U.S., suggest a new era in U.S.-Middle East relations. The escalating violence in Rafah has exacerbated the sense of distrust and despair that pervades the Middle East, fueling a cycle of anger and resentment that threatens to further destabilize the region. The conflict, often viewed through the prism of historical grievances and religious differences, has poisoned relations between Israelis and Palestinians, making the prospect of peaceful coexistence seem increasingly remote. The current crisis, with its devastating human toll and the failure of diplomacy to stem the bloodshed, has only deepened the sense of hopelessness and alienation, particularly among young people who see no end in sight to the conflict. The conflict has also provided fertile ground for extremism and radicalization, as groups like Hamas and Hezbollah exploit the grievances of the Palestinian people to advance their own agendas. The failure to achieve a just and lasting peace has created a vacuum that is often filled by those who preach violence and intolerance, further undermining the prospects for reconciliation and coexistence. The ongoing conflict, with its devastating human toll and its corrosive impact on regional stability, serves as a stark reminder of the urgent need for a just and lasting peace. The tragedy unfolding in Rafah serves as a stark reminder of the intractable nature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the human cost of its perpetuation. The Biden administration, caught between its commitment to Israel's security and its stated values of human rights and diplomacy, faces a defining moment. The path forward remains treacherous, fraught with the weight of history, the complexities of the present, and the uncertainties of the future. The administration's current approach, characterized by calls for restraint and behind-the-scenes diplomacy, has yet to yield a tangible breakthrough. The absence of a clear strategy to break the cycle of violence raises concerns about the administration's ability to navigate the complexities of the conflict and achieve a meaningful resolution. The crisis in Rafah is not merely a regional conflict, it is a global concern. The Biden administration, in concert with the international community, must seize this moment to chart a new course, one that prioritizes diplomacy, de-escalation, and a commitment to a future where Israelis and Palestinians can coexist in peace and security.